Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just about a minute as everyone's popping in to join us. And this is our second panel about writing your true self, authentic and diverse identities. And I will turn it over to our panelists.
Hey folks, I'm Virginia Black. I drew the short straw on being the moderator for today's session. So in just a moment, I'm going to pass off introduction to these fine authors to contribute their input to the discussion. I want to let you all know that I will be keeping an eye on the attendees list just to make sure that things are going away. All right, great. Let's go ahead and jump into this. Welcome to the Writing Your True Self Authentic and Diverse Identities panel here at Rainbow Space Magic 4.0. I haven't had a ton of time to chat with you both in advance, so this is going to be a fun free-for-all. So first of all, welcome. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Let's start with a bit of a brief intro, if you would, and then we'll get into the conversation questions. We may get some questions from the participants. I'll keep an eye on those, and then we'll kind of go back and forth. If the conversation's going hot and heavy, then we'll make sure we leave some time at the end. And of course, we'll wrap up with a way for you to share with folks how to get in touch with you on the World Wide Webs, or, you know, out at a coffee shop in your neck of the woods, probably not, and what work you've got on deck that they can check out. So tell us a little bit about yourselves. Gwen.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Gwen Tolios. I primarily write a lot of short fiction, fantasy short fiction, particularly a few science fiction stories as well. I also have a sapphic romance featuring aspec identities, if that's your cup of jam. And since we're talking about diverse identities today, I use the pronoun she, her, and then I identify as ace, I identify as bi, and I'm somewhere on the arrow spectrum. Haven't figured out where exactly yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Gwen. Alex.
My name is Alex Washoe, and I write, I guess most appropriately for this convention, I write queer fantasy time travel stories. I have a series called In the Queerness of Time, which has 3 books in it. They're all sapphic and or trans romances which involve time travel, and there's an overarching storyline for them. I also write LGBTQ plus romances. I have a series called For the Love of the Game, which is sports romances, contemporary, and there's about 5 of those. So my books always involve queer characters, frequently trans characters, and usually a sapphic romance. I am myself, I am trans, femme, non-binary. I use they, them pronouns.
Okay, I'm making a note of all of the stories that you just mentioned so that I can read them later. So let's, I'm going to hit at these questions that y'all send over in advance, and I'm going to hit them in a bunch of different order, right? So we may bounce around a little bit. But let's start with, how much of your identity do you...
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in. Virginia, you need to introduce yourself.
Oh, that's super important. Hi, I'm Virginia Black. She, her. I live in the Pacific Northwest. I write sapphic speculative fiction. My first novel, Consecrated Ground, a sapphic paranormal romance, came out earlier this year from Bywater Books. My next novel, which is a sci-fi romance, No Shelter But the Stars, is coming out in January. It's on pre-order now. I also write a number of short stories, and have dabbled in fan fiction. So I'm all over the place. Thanks, Gwen. Appreciate the prompt.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of your identity do you put into a story?
I can go first. Like, it really depends. And I found it depends as I get more comfortable in a genre, if that makes sense. So I'm just gonna duck. So like, returning to you, this is my sapphic romance featuring both of the leads are bi, one's arrow, one's ace. That's the story that I have where most of me is in there. So very, very queer, specifically for my identities. But I found like the more romance that I write, I kind of like peel back on my specific self and I try to explore other parts of the community. I've already shared me, so I want to share maybe other people and make sure that people who have slightly different experiences can see themselves in my book, and it's not just me over and over and over again. But for my first thing in like a type of genre or format, a lot of me.
How about you, Alex?
I think when I first started out, the first few books I wrote and published, I wasn't completely out myself. And therefore, I think if you go back and look at them, you can see that I was censoring myself a little bit. I mean, the queer themes are still there, but I was coming at them in a sort of sideways direction, not quite ready to reveal that much. But now I think my identity is all over my books. I write sapphic and or trans characters in every book I write. And so that draws on my experience and the experience of people I know. So I don't think I can separate my identity from the books I write.
Were you ever scared to write a queer book?
Yes.
All right, Alex.
Well, like I said, when I first started writing, I wasn't completely out yet. And so, and being a trans person and not being out, still sort of being closeted to myself and to other people, I'm a trans person who writes sapphic romances. So yes, I I have often questioned and still question sometimes, whether whether I belong in that space or whether I will be accepted in that space. So yeah, I mean, I have been and still remain sometimes afraid to be totally out there.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. And I'll
Gwen?
admit, I have not really been scared to write queer stories. I think it's kind of like you, Virginia. I grew up and cut my teeth in writing in the fan fiction world, and that is very, very queer. So a lot of queer writing there is very easily accepted. I will say, though, I was very nervous to identify as a queer author. So stating that in my bio what my identity was, using that as maybe part of marketing material, I wasn't quite sure how people would react to that announcement. And it's kind of funny because that's how my parents actually found out that I was even queer, was my Amazon profile. But that's the stuff that made me very nervous, was publicly being out versus writing the stories.
So I'm trying not to get distracted because I totally want to pull the thread on that. But
you are welcome to, and don't forget to answer some of these questions yourself.
So I will say that I don't put much of my identity in a story, just to backtrack. I think it depends on how a story begins. I don't start from a place of, okay, I'm gonna tell a story about this type of person, this lesbian. I'm gonna tell a story about a Black lesbian. I'm gonna tell a story about a 28-year-old white lesbian on a spaceship. I don't start that way. It's always characters that start whispering to me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I tell them to shut up for as long as I can until, unfortunately, they grow a soundtrack. And once the playlist shows up, I'm doomed. And then I tell their story. It's not about me. And I generally don't find the kernels of me until way later. I'm like, oh, actually, that little tiny piece was based on my own personal experience. But most of the time, I'm not writing my experience. That's those characters. I haven't been scared to write a queer book. I've been scared to write a book with a Black lead for my own concerns about whether or not white readers would buy it. There's still the perception, and I'm not sure that it's a bad one or an incorrect one, that for the default story, and I'm using default in quotation marks, that the default characters are white, and that all other identities are expected to acknowledge that default, but that default is not expected to acknowledge others. So my fear was white authors would not buy a book with a Black lead character. Too bad. Joan Matthews was Black. It was her story. She wasn't going to leave me alone, so off we went. But writing about queer characters, no. I will say that I have stuck to sapphic romance. I haven't ventured into other identities, and I don't know if I would. I think it will depend on when those characters start talking to me. So when is it important to tie a character's identity to the story, and when is it important to just let them exist as that identity?
I feel like I want like time to think through that one.
Yeah, it's kind of a big one, right?
Yeah, it is kind of a big one, and it's something that I've also struggled, I think, in doing readings. Like I mentioned before, I'm ace. There's not a lot of ace representation out there, so I tend to like devour everything that I can. And it always bugs me when I feel like the representation isn't like anything more than like tokenism. Because it's just a label a character has, but you don't see it really having a huge interaction or an impact on either the character's behavior themselves or within the plot. It doesn't have to be both, but I do think that to have like authentic representation, it can't just sit there. You have to see the impact somewhere in the story. Once again, whether it's within the characterization or within the plots and the action that's going on. But I don't think every queer story has to be about being queer. A lot of, especially in my short fiction, it's very casually clear. I'm very focused on what's happening in the space of the story versus let's, really dive deep into someone's identity.
How about you, Alex?
I think writing romance, that there's a certain amount of the romance genre puts, issues like sexuality and things like that front and center. But I tend to write about characters. The first romance I wrote, which was called Simply Connected, is kind of a coming out story. But the coming out has more to do with gender identity than sexuality. I guess it depends on the story. That's not really a very helpful answer, is it? I've written stories where identity was front and center. I wrote a book not too long ago about trans athletes, and that book put, the politics and the issues around being a trans athlete front and center. I've written other books where the characters are just, they're just queer, and they know it, and they take it for granted, and they go ahead into the with whatever the story is. So it really just depends on the book.
In my work, I tend to lean on the just let them exist. And as I've often said, I will not write coming out stories. I will not write stories that dig into those deeper social and identity issues, not because I don't find value in them, not because I don't want to see those stories or believe that we need those stories, because we absolutely do. We need all of them, and we need more of them, but that I do not do them well, and I am jumping to the, okay, what happens when we win? What happens when, the assumption for me in much of the, whether it's post-apocalyptic, whether it's on a spaceship, whether it's medieval, I don't care when it is it's a queer character. But we have a queer character, the end. That's not the story. And part of it, I think, is this is kind of revelatory for me, because I don't really think about how much of my own perception is in my work, which is silly. 5 minutes in a creative writing class would reveal that. But it's fantasy. It's a perfect world. Why would we mire ourselves in those things that we're dealing with on a daily basis, many of us? I want to escape from that. I want to tell me a good story, and I want to offer that good story. But it's merely an alternative. It's merely another choice for folks. There are coming out stories that are important. I came out because of coming out stories, right? Because I read those stories. I found my identity because of stories about people exploring their identity, right? So those things are valuable. I just am not the soul who is currently writing them. Let's see. I like this question, mostly because I want to hear how y'all did it. Can you tell me a little bit about the last character you created and how you went about it? And it doesn't necessarily have to be the last character you created, but the first character that comes to mind that seems awesome.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go with the last character that I created. I'm working on a short story right now involving Jenny Greenteeth. So if anyone knows her mythology.
I don't. Educate me.
Oh, okay. I run into this problem a lot where I just like obscure mythology. So Jenny Greenteeth is like a Celtic well spirit. So she's typically very malicious, sharp teeth, green, kind of the similar behaviors of a kelp bee, but she's human. And so I'm writing a story where she is sort of as working as an avenging spirit. So I had to create a character that she's avenging. So his name is Hector right now. And the way that my character creation goes is I'm a discovery writer. So I discover who a character is as I'm writing. So the more I write him, the more I'm learning about him. And it's probably going to change when I edit it, because that happens all the time. But characters don't just pop into my head. I have maybe a skeleton of them, and I flesh them out as I get deeper and deeper into the story.
Let me know when that's done, please.
I've been working on it for a while, so we'll see. I don't know. I have no idea when I'm going to finish it.
Awesome. Thanks, Gwen. Alex?
Well, I just released a book, the third book in my time travel series, which is called Heart of Time. And there's a character in that book, Francesca Diotima, who is a 16th century scientist slash artist slash rogue, I guess you would say. And I'm not sure. I think I have a general idea of a character, because I'm not a discovery writer. I actually do a lot of planning up front, a lot of plot work and stuff up front. So I have a general idea of the character, but I find that as I write, the characters seem to they sort of accumulate, traits and things. And so to create her, I started off doing research on the time period and everything, and some of the lesser known, because everybody knows, you know, Leonardo da Vinci and people like that, but there were actually some female figures in that time period who are lesser known artists and writers and things. So I did some research on those people, and then I just try to find the voice, because I write in first person a lot. Most of my romances are alternating first person point of view, and it's really a matter of finding the voice, and sometimes I don't in the beginning. Like in my last book, the other character, the modern character, it took me longer to find her voice, and then they just pick up things, you know, and so she ends up being, you know, part Leonardo and a lot of other things, even a little bit of Puss in Boots in the voice. So yeah, I mean, I do a lot of planning, but there's still a lot of discovery too, as I write.
The last character I wrote was a 17th century masculine passing woman who becomes a vampire, and it's her origin story. And I could see the character, but it took me a while to figure out her voice, and also how to convey. It was also a writing exercise in a way. This is a short from an upcoming anthology that's actually coming out in a few weeks. It took me a while to find the way, not necessarily her voice, but her perception, the way that she sees and categorizes everyone around her, and how that reflected who she is. Y'all have to check it out and tell me whether I was successful or not. But it was much more important to convey those details through that very limited lens. And you would think that would be pretty wide, but it's actually a really, really limited. And I only got to do it in about 5,000 or 6,000 words. So like, I gotta.
Stories are tough.
Yeah, they're like, okay, I need to convey. It's not just weighing every word. I wish I was Ted Chiang, but I'm not. When it comes to writing, he seems to measure every last word, and every and the is perfectly placed. But I found that almost every word had three purposes. Like, okay, this needs to do this, and it needs to do this, and it also needs to convey that. And so that was more difficult than the identity piece, although it was part of the story for someone to see her true self behind the male presenting, since she was passing, and recognize her for who she is, which is what leads to her doom or her rising. It depends on how you feel about vampires. So that was a fun exercise. Under time constraints, so there were a lot of boundaries around that one that made it very, very interesting. So what kinds of challenges do you face when writing these? I don't know if I necessarily love the word diverse, but it's the word we've got, so we're going to use it. What challenges do you face when writing these characters, and whether that's in writing or even publishing, like, and through the whole process, start to finish?
I know when I first started starting in publishing, I had a few problems in that my stories were too casually queer, if that makes sense. So I had a story that was shopping around about a college student who didn't realize that she was in love with her best friend until her best friend had died. So she's having these conversations with her ghost. And then what I had submitted to a magazine, and a magazine like came back to me, and their only feedback was, oh, I didn't realize this was queer until like a page from the end. I was like, oh, okay. So I changed a line right before I submitted it to the next magazines, where instead of like in the bathroom brushing her teeth, she's putting on mascara because it's ta-da, cute, she's a woman. And it got accepted immediately. So I was like, oh, all right. So I felt like I have like seen some barriers, especially early on when I was publishing. I feel like now there's just more like queer first publishers out there. I actually like worked with a publisher earlier this year, and in their first email to me, they asked me my pronouns. I was like, no one has done that before in the industry. Like, amazing. So I feel like there has been some publishing issues that I've run into. In terms of like writing, I like to make sure that I'm just not falling into stereotypes. That tends to be my holdup, because there's just a lot of queer identities out there, and I only share 3 of them. So if I want to write someone who isn't in there, I like to consume a lot of media produced by those identities, typically actually like biopics. I don't necessarily want to read their fiction. To your point, Virginia, like you've mentioned before, like you don't want to have that coming out story and that kind of in-depth feelings, but I feel like I need to understand those in order to write a story about someone who has that identity. Because I don't just want to rely on what I'm being, fed from TV or whatnot. So that's a difficult thing for me, is just consuming and finding that media that I could use as sort of my baseline, to build a character up from.
I do the same sort of thing. I mean, I read widely in queer fiction anyway. That's just something that I've always done and that I still do. If I specifically, a lot of the characters I've written, main characters, have been people who share at least one of my identities, who are on the same axes. I haven't ventured out into some of the other queer identities as much for main characters. I really try hard to populate my stories. One of the criticisms that I've gotten a few times from beta readers and things is that, there's just too many queer characters in the book. And it's like, I grew up in a time when there were no queer characters in media. And so what I like to say is that I'm not even interested in just having queer characters or queer storylines anymore. I want a queer world, So I really try to populate my stories with queer characters as much as I can. Even so far as I frequently, deliberately, with minor characters, will not give them pronouns. Like I'll describe them, but I don't give them any pronouns. Sometimes not even they, them. To just sort of, I mean, I know some people will just, as you said, will just default to what they will just go to the default. But I want to kind of upset that automatic assumption about who people are and what their identities are. So I try to do that as much as I can when I'm writing. I'm not sure that actually answered the question. I may have lost the thread somewhere, but
well, we're pulling threads, but you bring up a point, so I'm not even going to answer the question. This idea of too many queer characters, when I was first coming out, most of my friends were queer. At a time when so I came out in the late 80s, early 90s. So I've been around for, a couple minutes. you gravitate to the people that you want to be. You gravitate to the people who share your world, who share your identity. And when you're defining yourself, that means other queer folks. And then when you get older, you support your friends who have queer businesses. You want to make sure that when you are throwing money into the world, that it is raising up the communities that you care about, right? So whenever I need a new vendor for something, I need a new plumber, I need a new whatever, I'm looking for queer owned, I'm looking for Black owned, I'm looking for woman owned, right? Because that's my experience. And so I want to help raise those up. Reading fiction that has too many queer characters to me sounds like so much BS. I know we're not supposed to use harsh language here. I curse like a sailor, so I have to really step back. But I am not only surprised by that criticism, I kind of reject it on your behalf. Like, how dare you? This is interesting though, because I did have to write a couple of characters, and I don't flat out say that they're straight, but I do assume that the reader will interpret them as default as being straight. And I kind of need to look at that. This is kind of a hit list for things that I need to pay attention to in my own writing. So that brings up, so how do you write about characters who aren't you? How do you, what steps do you take to make sure that they have, I know that I think it was Alex mentioned some of those earlier, those characters read as true? Have you ever worked with a sensitivity reader, or for the things outside of your experience? And how did that go? So it's kind of a 3-part question. Alex, you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, my very first book, my first 2 books were actually Westerns, although they have a trans main character. And it wasn't exactly a sensitivity reader, but it was an early beta reader, someone that was recommended to me that I didn't know personally, and they tore the book up. And one of the things they specifically called me out on was my portrayal of a secondary character who was Hispanic, and who was at the time I wrote it, who was the housekeeper for the main characters. And they tore me up, and they said, you know, this is a very stereotypical kind of presentation, and I think they even used the word racist. And obviously it was devastating to get the feedback at first. But I kind of have this rule that the more feedback upsets me, the more I probably need to pay attention to it. And so they were right. It was a very stereotypical representation, and I completely rewrote the book and made this person a bigger character and a relative to the main characters, which changed the main character's backstory completely, and I think made it much, much richer. So I try to get that feedback. I try to get as much of that feedback as I can. I had extensive correspondence with a mathematician when I wrote Simply Connected, because I am not a mathematician, and I wanted my mathematician character to read. This is sort of a different element of identity, but I wanted her to read authentic. I wanted someone who was in that world, if they picked up the book, to say, this sounds like a mathematician. And so I try to get as much feedback and look specifically for feedback relating to the characters that I'm writing. I think feedback is just feedback is the silver bullet for most of the ills of fiction. And I don't know how I could do this without as much feedback as possible.
Yeah, I would second that. I tend to seek out not necessarily a sensitivity reader, but a group of beta readers who can connect with the stories that I'm writing. So for my romance, I mentioned earlier that I currently identify as somewhere on the arrow spectrum, but I didn't at the time I wrote the book. So, you know, that happened. So I made sure that people who were within my beta reader group were arrow. I wanted to make sure that I had people of color in my group because one of my leads is actually Latina. And a side plot was actually that one of the characters is dealing with the realization that a parent is developing dementia. So I wanted to make sure that I had someone in my reader group who had experience with dealing with a family member who had that and making sure the experiences that I was describing were real. So you do your own research, of course. Like I mentioned before, I tend to seek out more of like biopic type of comics and little mini essays and such, so I can understand how people feel about their identity. And then incorporate it into my fiction. But then I also want people that I know who connect in some way to give me that feedback as well. Like you were saying, Alex, like they're the people who are going to be able to tell us like, okay, does this feel wrong and stereotypical? I feel like the more negative someone is reacting to something, the stronger the stereotype that I've leaned into. So it's also a good indication of, okay, this is where I need to step back. This is where I need to make someone maybe a little more nuanced, seek out more POVs that I can kind of use to temper my, you know, biases in my head. So it's a process, I will say. But I think it's a process that we all really need to do, especially if it's outside of our own identities.
I have not yet worked with a sensitivity reader or done the level of research that you were suggesting, but I have a Vietnamese American co-lead on one of my stories, and I really need to do a deep dive and bring out, particularly since this next novel is really about exploring her coming into her own. I need to define where she's from and who she is before I can really demonstrate how she is stepping into, for lack of a better phrase, her own truth. Not a phrase I love, but that's what I'm looking for.
I think
so. We probably have a few new writers here in the chat. Any advice that you would give newer writers who aspire to create these diverse characters, to explore some of these other voices?
Read own voices fiction and nonfiction. Honestly, that's a great way to do it. Have open communication with people with those identities. So not necessarily like consuming content that they had, but like literally just sit down and talk to someone about their experiences. That's one of the great things that I like about my friend group. We tend to be pretty diverse. We tend to be pretty open. So we can talk about this something, you know, how this impacted us or how that impacted us. You have to be open to learning at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, like Gwen said, I think the first and most important thing is read as widely as you can. Take feedback. You know, try to try to acknowledge your limitations and be open to being told it's that you got it wrong, and it doesn't mean you're a terrible person, or it doesn't mean you're, you know, and you know, I love the idea that anybody can write anybody, but I'm not completely sure it's true. I mean, for instance, I find it very, very hard to write cis male characters. I'm not sure that I could write convincingly from the point of view of a cis male character. I think there's probably psychological scars in there somewhere, keeping me from doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think every group of people has stories that are theirs to tell, and it's important to realize it's one thing to have a character from a certain group. It's another thing to tell certain kinds of stories about them.
So you bring up an interesting point, because that was going to be my next question. And this one wasn't on the list that we talked about earlier. So pop quiz. There's telling a layered story, which is what we're talking about, right? And exploring a story that contains all of these different identities and different experiences, and telling that story in a way that has some truth and some power to it. And then there are the stay in your lane stories. So where's that line? And you kind of touched on that, Alex, and that's why I wanted to the examples of stories that you would not touch, or that you would trust that, all right, that one's not in my lane, I need to leave that elsewhere. I can't think of any specific stories that have come to me that I have thought, yeah, actually I can't tell that story. And just to put a pin on the previous question, the only advice that I would give writers is don't tell the story. Please don't let fear of getting it wrong keep you from making the attempt. There are so many ways that we police ourselves as writers. I mean, do your due diligence. It took a while for me to see myself in a story, because at first, what is now sapphic fiction to some extent was lesbian fiction that was predominantly white women characters. So cis women, and not flat, like no depth, no diversity at all. And any diversity was very much a cartoon cutout, not a cartoon cutout, like one of those standing cutouts that you see at a movie theater. So when do you, to get back to the question, where's that lane? Do you know where that line is for you? Alex mentioned one for them. Gwen, do you have one?
I do, but I wouldn't say it has to do with like queer identities. I would say it would have to do with racial identities. I've written POC characters before, but I specifically written those who are part of the diaspora community, immigrant communities. My mom actually immigrated to the States when she was a child. So I feel like a lot of struggles that cross those identities in terms of how do you connect with your home culture? What parts do you keep? What parts do you not? How can you integrate with people who have been here? How American are you? How non-American are you? Is something that I could relate to, and I can see that in a variety of, different communities. But I wouldn't be able to write from someone whose family has been here for 7 generations or 3 generations, and they're just very immersed in that other community. It always has to be someone who has their toes in both worlds. That's a situation I'm familiar with, and so that's what I try to keep with, even if the minority that I'm writing about would shift between like a Latina character, or I've got one who is Japanese. So that's probably my line, but I have written trans characters, I've written gay characters, bi characters, ace and allo. So from a queer standpoint, I'm much more likely to write broadly, but I also think because that's the community they interact with a lot, that's where I have a lot of stories and understanding.
Awesome.
I think I think one thing that sort of goes to that question is, for instance, in writing fantasy, I draw a lot on different mythologies and and for me, there's a line that I try to draw. I'm not sure that I'm completely successful, but for instance, it's one thing to draw from, ancient mythologies. It's a very different thing to draw on living cultures. And I would be really extremely careful about drawing on a living religion or a living culture the way that I might draw on, ancient cultures.
Fair. I will say most of my
Christian readers
answers.
may take me to task for that, but
Yeah.
Fantasy is different than contemporary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, I'd be really, really careful and handle a living culture very differently. And I think that's, that's something that maybe I'm not willing to take on.
Yeah. All right. So we have 4 minutes left. I want to urge folks who, if you have any questions, you want to follow up this this conversation with any other points for us to dig a little deeper. I want to remind you that there is a Discord server and that there are threads for each of the panels or rooms for each of the panels. So you could pop in and ask any questions or continue the conversation. So in 90 seconds or less, tell folks how to find you and find your work and what's coming up that you want folks to know about. Alex?
How to find me? I'm on Facebook, just Alex Washoe. That's about the limit of my social media. My books are all on Amazon. Again, Alex Washoe. I just had a book come out. So my
Awesome.
most recent book came out like earlier this month.
Congratulations.
So, yeah. That's where I am.
Thanks, Alex. Gwen?
So I'm Gwen Tolios around most of the web except for Facebook. I actually don't use that. So I'm on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram. I am probably a rarity in that my social media of choice is actually Tumblr. I am there a lot. So I actually post regular free flash fiction on my Tumblr. So if you just want to kind of see how I write, you're welcome to find me there. Gwen Tolios is my name pretty much across the board. You can also find me on Amazon, Goodreads. I have books in Hoopla and Libby. If you just want to read it through the library, I would appreciate that. And I also have a website, gwentolios.com.
Awesome. VirginiaBlackWrites.com. All the socials right up here. I'll also drop them in the room over on the Discord server, but you can pretty much find me everywhere as Virginia Black or Virginia Black Writes. Consecrated Ground is out now. Soul Food Stories is an anthology for the season, coming out in just a couple of weeks. And No Shelf Look at the Stars is my sapphic sci-fi romance coming out in January. In just a little bit, the next panel will be research versus experience, different approaches to knowing. Later on is the keynote from Laser Weber. We have more panels coming tomorrow. Check out the schedule. Make sure that you, like I said, follow us over in the Discord server. I want to thank both of you for being here and for having such a great conversation about this content. I hope that folks will follow up and apply it to their own writing or explore some new stories. So thanks a lot, y'all. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for moderating, Virginia.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. And hats off to Rainbow Space Magic for having us all here to share all of this awesome material. All right, great. Thanks everyone.